This is lecture 2, writing strategies. How do you write an empirical paper, basically? This is kind of the core of this course's lecture. I mean, then the next component is, of course, the ethics part. But for you as kind of junior kind of researchers and upcoming PhD students, this part and then the ethics part is the most important part. Publication, we'll talk about it again when you finish the PhD. It's no problem. So this is how papers look like. You have the title, you have the abstract, the JL codes, keywords, acknowledgements, everything. That's the title page. Then you have the introduction section, then the theoretical or conceptual framework, or we call it theory of change, where you state your hypothesis, what you're testing. And then you have the data section, which is, it can be experimental data or, secondary data. Then the empirical framework, that means like your estimation strategy, what kind of estimation identification strategy you use, results, discussion, summary, and concluding remark, references, appendix. This is how the paper looks like. So this is the sequencing of the paper. But how many of you know that this section is written last? Do you know that? Raise your hand. The introduction is written last. When I was a PhD student, I didn't know about that. So, and then actually it is written, so the abstract is even written after the introduction. I mean, there's always sometimes some people write the abstract first, to use it as kind of a guideline to see what they will write. But the most important part that I want you to remember is, actually this is written last. And you start with your hypothesis and questions, and then maybe a bit of literature review as well. And as you can see, there's also a section on literature review. This is also another option. Some places, they ask you to have a 2-3 page literature review on a paper. But in real empirical paper, we don't have that anymore. You incorporate the literature review section in the introduction section. That's where you show your contribution. So the introduction should show what is the paper about, the research question, how you answer the research question, what you find, what are the key findings, and also how do you contribute to the literature. That's where you make a brief recap of the literature. So literature review separately, I mean, it's not no. I mean, if you feel like doing it, I mean, there's some reasons sometimes to use it. I will explain those when we discuss. But in general, like 90% of the papers don't have a literature review section published in those journals. So they usually incorporate it into the introduction section. All right. So the theoretical framework, so we're starting from this part, right? So we go discuss all of them one by one and come back to the introduction and the abstract and the title. So what is a theoretical framework? Well, you call it theory of change, so many different names, conceptual framework. The paper's goal is specifying, does X cause Y? Does providing credit to farmers increase agricultural productivity? Right? Does providing subsidy to new energy appliances reduce charcoal consumption by enterprises, etc.? This is like the cause and effect relationship that you want to identify. It begins with a theory of change. It's usually best to focus on a single important question you answer well. That's a classic mistake that we make when we're a PhD student and we write a paper on the determinants of foreign direct investment. There is no determinant. You see, the determinant of foreign direct investments is really a wrong question because none of those variables that you put in the right-hand side are determinants. They just correlates. They are correlated with the outcome variable of interest. Let's say that the outcome variable of interest is GDP. So you're interested in the impact of those factors on GDP? No, you can't possibly do that. No one can possibly do that because all of them are endogenous. Right? They are correlated with the error term. So you cannot identify any causal relationship. So what do you have to do? If you write a paper, then you pick up one single factor. Right? One single factor. Like foreign direct investment, for example. Right? How does it affect growth? Or monetary policy, or money supply, or whatever it is. You just pick only one variable, which is, that variable is what we call X, and your outcome variable is what we call Y. So does incentivized communication increase willingness to pay for new technologies? This is another question that's from one of the published papers that I will share with you. So you answer this question well using a credible identification of strategy. That means a credible way to identify the relationship between X and Y. So how do you change your theory of change into a proper theoretical framework? I mean, if you pick up some of the papers I will send you, you'll see that some of them use kind of text to explain their hypothesis. Some of them use mathematical equations, like a consumer theory or a firm's profit maximization equation, and etc. in their theory. So the theory of change for your topic, let's say, that has been investigated exhaustively by theorists. For example, we know how price affects demand. I mean, this is a theory of demand. You don't need a conceptual framework to explain that to the reader because it is assumed to be understood by everyone. This was exhaustively investigated by people before. But in that case, you just make a brief mentioning of what you are interested in and just move on to the next section. You don't need to go into the details. So the theory of change for your topic has not been investigated by theorists. This is a second case. So people did not really relate those two variables and discuss them in economics terms, and you're coming up to be the first person to describe that relationship. Well, if that's the case, congratulations. So that's really a novel research question. Well, the next challenge would be, how are you going to verify it using empirical data? But at least you are on the right track. Then in that case, you clearly state the theory of change. It can be mathematical or verbal, and then it is always recommended to have one in any applied paper. Okay? To what extent are you going to present it? Do you have 5 pages or 4 pages of deriving equations? That's a no-go. Compress it in a page and a half and leave the rest for the appendix section. That's the way to go. So always you have to have an empirical, a theory of change section. Sometimes editors and reviewers may force you to drop or reduce or move it to the appendix. Sometimes. I mean, you send the paper and say that, we don't need these theory of changes. Mathematics is just boring. Some reviewers feel that way. Some other reviewers like seeing the equations to immediately see how you're relating what variables with what. So if you are forced to do that, then it's okay to move it into the appendix. And if you feel strongly about it, that you really want to keep it there, then you have to challenge the reviewer or the editor. But this happens sometimes. Yeah.
Can I just please ask a follow-up question based on what you said?
Yes.
So, for example, in my case, one of the objectives that I'm doing for my PhD, it's based on an augmented Phillips curve. So there are a couple of equations that I'm estimating.
Yes.
So does it mean then that I don't derive and express those equations?
No, you do.
Refer them to the appendix?
Yes. So it depends. So if it is too long, it's usually recommended to put it in the appendix.
There were 5 of them, and then the main focus ones were the 3.
Yes.
So do I express the 3, or should I just...
All the 5?
Because I'm not focusing on the 5, it's mainly the 3 that I'm using for...
Yeah, if 2 equations, this is sometimes a judgment call as well. So you see, there is no clear guide, like, the number of equations should be this much, or below this, above this. You just look at it, how it flows. Okay, it's not taking too much space. You're not repeating too already, something that people are really familiar. Then you reduce it, right? You just compress it. So it's a bit of a judgment call, but I don't see a big difference between like putting in 3 of the equations or 5. You might say that these are the other components, but I'm focusing on these 3. So it's very subjective. So there's no clear rule on that. But one thing we can agree is you need a section on the theoretical or theory of change. How does X affect Y? What is just the pathway? You have to show us that using verbal description or mathematical equations. Then, once you did that, you explained, right? Let's say that I'm interested in, I'll give you the classic case that most of the parts that I'm working now, one project that I'm working on is in some places in Nigeria. Nigeria is the case, the country. So we had people, the power supply is really bad. I mean, South Africa is bad too, but the great thing about South African load shedding is you're informed in advance most of the time. In Nigeria, nobody informs you. They turn it off right away, anytime. So people, what do? They need backup generators. So they buy these backup generators, but these backup generators are really bad. So they pollute the environment. They make irritating noise, air pollution, and it's also expensive for the businesses. So what we identified is that we can measure at some point there was exogenous variation in the amount of electricity that certain neighborhoods get. So I don't know if anyone who heard about regression discontinuity design, or DD. It's an impact evaluation method where you can measure the impact of a certain exogenous intervention by comparing the cutoff points above cutoff points or below a certain cutoff point. Let me give you a very clear, brief example. Let's see that you want to measure the impact of a scholarship on, female students. We gave them scholarships. For those who have got 75 or above, they will get scholarship. So if you have 74, will you get it? If you have 76, you will get it. But do you really think that there's a big difference between someone with 74 and 76? No. So we call them people in the neighborhood of the cutoff point. But how about the person who's got 51 and the person who's got 98? They're massively different. So as you increase the bandwidth, that means from the cutoff points, go down or above. As you go further, what happens? The two groups become completely different. As you get closer to the cutoff point, the groups become similar. So what's the basic strategy? To be as close as possible. But you can't do that as well sometimes. Why? Because if you get too close, what happens to the sample size? It goes down, significantly goes down. So that's exactly the regression discontinuity. So if you have enough sample around the cutoff point, just below and just above, you can compare the impact of scholarship on grades or whatever it is that you want to measure. This is called regression discontinuity design. So we used that thing in the Nigerian case. So we wanted to build a theoretical model because we haven't seen someone done it before, but it's, of course, it's a classical kind of investment decision by an enterprise. So we wanted to construct a theoretical framework that shows exactly, so the firm's idea is always to maximize profit and reduce cost. So you derive those cost equations and compare the costs and the benefits of the two alternatives, like from electricity versus burning burning generator gas. So we constructed a theoretical framework. So, and then that will guide the data collection. So this is what we do. Then we go to the data and descriptive statistics once you completed the conceptual framework. Source of the data. When was it collected? By whom? And what kind of sampling did you use? All right, let's say that you use the data from the needs data, the National Income Panel Dynamics. Okay, then that's not your data. This is collected by the needs data. So you explain in 2 paragraphs how the sampling was done, what kind of purposive sampling was it, with sampling weights, etc., etc. But if you collected it yourself, if it is an experimental data, for example, you collect it yourself. You have to explain how you collected that data. How can you ensure that this is representative of the population? Because in every sampling, the main purpose is to represent the population. Using the sample, you want to say something about the population. You explain that. How was missing data handled? Did you throw away all those variables, those observations that have missing data, or did you fill them in? Using average values, people do all sorts of those things. It depends. There is no any unique answer to that, but you have to be honest about how you deal with missing data, especially when you are using, publicly available data. Every data for that matter. When you work panel data, there's an issue called attrition. It must be discussed. Attrition means, but you have 2 rounds of panel data or 3 rounds. Some of the individuals might have exited from the panel. They were not able to track them. Okay, that's what we call attrition. And if there is attrition, like significant attrition, it can bias your results. So you have to test for it, that it doesn't bias the results. And you have to explain that in the data section. You introduce all the variables used in the paper, especially the outcome variables. What are your outcome variables? Let's say it's consumption. How is consumption measured? You know, is it on monthly, on a daily basis? How did you do the aggregation? All that should be discussed. Descriptive statistics of key variables. You have to comment on the key variables. Usually one paragraph is enough, or two, to discuss, you know, the socioeconomic characteristics of your sample. If it is enterprise, you know, what's the size, what's the capital, what type of industry do they represent, etc., etc. So this section is very important. It has to give the confidence to the reader that this is trustable data. So the previous discussion was if it is data from secondary sources. How about an experimental data? So usually you also might do your own experiment. You know, these days randomized controlled trials are very common. How many of you have taken a course on randomized controlled trial? Yes, okay. 1, you 2, 3, only 3 people? That's probably our next course. Yeah, yeah, great. So, okay, what is an RCT? Briefly, RCT 101 in just like 1 minute. So you pick up people, you know, you have a population of interest. Let's say that is households in PE, Port Elizabeth City. So you want to save energy or water. So you want to plan a certain intervention. So you recruited 1,000 representative households. For 500 of them, you pick them based on a lottery, a random generator. It should be lottery. Pick them up, 500 of them, and give them some intervention, a technology that saves water. That's an RCT. So you collect data before the intervention, you collect data after the intervention. This is what we call a randomized experiment or field experiment. So in these kinds of cases, how do you report your data on an experiment? Well, you have to explain the context. Where and why was the experiment conducted? Why was it necessary to do it in PE, not in UC, not in Cape Town or other cities? You might have reasons. Oh, this is a place where there is water scarcity and we need water saving. So you can motivate it that way. Did the authors register the experiment in their pre-analysis plan? You have to register experiments before you implement them. You have to get ethical clearance, and also they have to be registered. If you don't do that, very simple, you're not going to be able to publish it in good journals. That's the bottom line. Sample selection, because the reason is they're very sensitive. Experiments are very sensitive as well. So you have to have really a plan, and you cannot do data mining and fishing of results, because there's this bias by researchers always to look for statistically significant results. Huh? So there used to be a friend, actually, well, not a friend, but someone who was saying that we have to torture the data until it confesses. So you can't torture the data. You have to have clean empirical strategy. That if the results are not significant, that's also important result. If your experiment, now for example, we just completed one randomized control trial in Tanzania. It was an intervention. The intervention was providing information to enterprises. Like using charcoal is bad for the environment. It does this. It destroys the forest. It affects the health of your staff and everything. You know, Tanzania loses this much amount of charcoal every year. These trees or forests, 125,000 hectares per year because of charcoal consumption. But we have an alternative for you, which is a solar technology that boils water using solar energy. It's expensive, but in the long run, you will save costs from it. How much are you willing to pay for it? Can you guess? There was no difference, no impact whatsoever. That means the restaurants didn't really care if charcoal destroys the environment or not. It's not their concern. It's understandable because these are restaurants, so they want to make profit. So the main driving factor of willingness to pay is liquidity constraint. That means if you either reduce the cost or give them some credit. That's the policy option. That's what we learn. So this is what we call completely null results. We don't have any significant results. But does that mean that the research is dead? No. It will be published. No question about it. But we registered the experiment. We specified the hypothesis. So you have to do the same. It's very important to be, aware of this fear of insignificant results. I mean, this is a deeply engraved problem. that is also one of the reasons why all these unethical research practices actually increased, because journals also contributed to this. Usually people studied actually how they make decisions, and null results are not published very often. You see, it's subconscious. This is not significant. We did an experiment. If it is not significant, we're not interested in it. But that's not good, because that would encourage the researchers to manipulate the data and promote unethical research practice. So that's important. But journals nowadays are becoming aware. So they will never reject you. Actually, the good journals especially, they cannot reject you because your result is null. As long as you registered it first and you specify this is what I want to collect, this is what I find, if you're honest about it. The treatment is the timeline. What kind of treatment is it? I told you now the experiment in Tanzania, that was an information treatment. You discuss it. Why did you choose it? And there's what we call internal, external validity. Internal validity means that you allocated treatment within the group using randomization. So that means internally it is valid. So you explain that, and then you have descriptive statistics, randomization checks, and things. So hold on. So randomization checks. Let's say, so you realize that I gave you the example, like you choose 1,000 firms, you select 500 randomly. 500. When you compare the characteristics of those 500 and 500 treatment and control group, will they be similar or not? They will be similar. There will not be statistically significant difference between the two groups because they did not self-select themselves. So that's what we call randomization check, right? That you have to verify that the sample is balanced. That means there is no difference between the treatment and the control group on average. So that's what we call randomization check. And then remember one important thing in experiments, if you do. A small mistake can ruin the entire project. So you have to make sure that you took all the maximum care to avoid those. And be as open and transparent as possible. Yes, what was the question?
And can I please get clarity?
Yeah.
So with the RSNT, is it like quantitative data that's predicted like peer surveys?
Yes.
And it's also like primary data because you go and collect it?
Yes, it's primary data. Yes, it's classified. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you can use whatever kind of, sometimes what you can do is, it's the institution that is implementing the experiment that's collecting it. If it is for your thesis, for your PhD thesis, and you collected it, it's your primary data. But it's primary data, but on the other hand, it's experimental data as well. But not all primary data are experimental. So that's the bottom line.
So would you like advise someone who's doing a regional study to like conduct an RCT?
Yes.
Basis on a game?
Yes, if the data is not available. I mean, RCTs give us a very good, we have a whiteboard, right? Good. Alpha B1, X1, B2, X2, 3. So this is the standard good old OLS. Do you remember? The ordinary least square estimation. The ordinary least square estimation is blue. Best linear unbiased estimator. When? There are 5 conditions. We call them the Gauss-Markov conditions. A1 is the expected value of the error term is 0. A2, the variance of the error term is sigma squared. This is what we call homoscedasticity. Well, usually actually we put it A3. Variance of EI is equal to sigma squared. A2 is the expected value of EI xi, and EI is 0. That means the error terms and these x variables are not correlated. A4, or less, the expected value of EI and EJ is 0, no auto correlation. There was another, so you need all these four OLS to be blue. Another A5, the error term is normally distributed around mean 0 and sigma square. We need this for statistical inference. Usually you can meet this. Or even if you violate the homoscedasticity principle, it's not a big problem. It will only affect your standard errors. The coefficients will be still unbiased. This is the biggest headache for all applied researchers. If you collect use secondary data that was collected, from like 1,000 individuals, you try to identify the relationship between X and Y, you can't. Why? Simply because this assumption will be violated. A good example is education. You remember education? The wage equation? This is like wage. Let's say this is wage. All right? Wage is a function of what? Your experience, your age, your industry, etc. But the most important one is education. Let's call it this education, this T. Can you collect like 1,000 individuals' wage data and then say that this is the impact of education on wage? No, because education here is capturing not only really years of schooling, but also other factors, right? Or there are other factors that affect education. So the most important one, what we call ability or motivation. So those who are going for higher education usually would be highly motivated people. But you can't capture that. So that motivation is where? In the error term. So whenever education changes, E also changes. The two will always be correlated. So you can't identify this. So the Gauss-Markov assumption will fail. The same is true on, credit, the impact of credit on agricultural productivity. All right, the impact of training, etc. This is where a randomized controlled trial comes in handy, because this treatment, for example, the way to test is, of course, I'm telling you, like, ideally, the way, to give you another example, like a more realistic experimental example, let's say in a state yi is yield, okay, agricultural yield, okay? Then you have the BO, B1, X1 plus B2, X2 plus, and B3, X3 plus EI. So this is the yield equation that I want to estimate. So this X, one of them is credit. Okay? So you offer people credit. This is a very classic and very elementary research question. Does access to credit improve agricultural productivity? Because using credit or inputs on credit, you can use into your farm, and obviously you can improve productivity. But the big question is, you go to a certain, a few villages and collect 1,000 farmers and ask them, who wants credit? Some of them will raise their hand and they will take it. Some others will not. When you collect that kind of data, you cannot use it to identify the impact of credit on yield, because these people self-selected themselves. But if you collected this 1,000 and randomly using lottery, you divided them into 500, 500. This is a treatment group, this is a control group. You give it to the treatment group without the control group knowing about it. Of course, there are actually, if you go to the details, I'm very simplifying it, but this is not really. RCT by itself is a 1-week course, just so you know. Now, what happens? Okay, you treat these individuals exogenously, the other individuals will be the control group. Then come back after a year, after production, and then measure yield. You will clearly see an effect of the treatment. Those who receive the treatment will have higher productivity. This is the beauty of randomized controlled trials. But if you do not use a randomized control trial, you collected simply observational data and try to identify the impact, this assumption will break. That's why we need RCTs. One big problem with RCTs, at least based on this discussion, especially for a PhD student, it is expensive. It requires the involvement of so many institutions. I just completed this RCT that I told you. It costed about $100,000. Well, don't lose your hope. It doesn't mean that all experiments are as very expensive like that. but that's kind of in the kind of medium range. Well, there's another one actually in a course, RCT course, I present that paper. There's a guy, a great guy called McKenzie. David McKenzie. David is based in at the World Bank. He did an experiment on the impact of offering loans or grants to enterprises, actually in Nigeria. What they did was they gave them money to enterprises and see whether, because the big question they want to answer is capital constraining growth of enterprises in Africa? If that is the case, the only way to test this is using an experiment. So what did they do? They give like a $5,000, or I don't remember the figure, $5,000 per firm, randomly. And then they measure their output, like after 5 is what happened to their employment, what happened to their productivity, and then things like that. And the cost of the experiment, I think I remember, was about 35 million USD. That's the most expensive experiment that I've heard about. I agree. But I can tell you another very interesting experiment as well that I use in the RCT course. It's a paper published in JD. It's in the reference list, so I will share it with you. It's Kazi and Ali. So these people, what they did was in Pakistan, they gave, these days people have mobile phones, right? So there's social media and everything that has increased significantly. So misinformation, disinformation, stress related to social media use, it's a big problem all over the world now. What they try to do is, if we provide some kind of training on people, for example, to differentiate fake news, because the more educated you are, you'll be able to differentiate fake news. But if you really are illiterate, a housewife, you only respond to whatever you see, whether it comes from this source, that source. So what did they do? They designed a kind of an online training that gives trainings to these people based on like Facebook's recommendation on differentiating fake news. And then that training is like what, 20 minutes training? So the intervention is that training. So the outcome variable is what? Their ability to differentiate fake news versus true news or correct news. I don't know how much it costed, but I wouldn't expect it to be more than $2,000, that experiment. Probably not. It's just the time of the data collectors. They did everything online. So you can do experiments as cheap as that and publish it in a great journal. It was published in the Journal of Development Economics. So anyways, details about this course next time. But the long story is experimental data is becoming very common. And then if you have the opportunity, of course, you should do an experiment. And you have to detail it and explain how the experiment has been conducted in the paper in that section, the data section. All right, avoid, so I'm writing tips, avoid using past tenses and usually passive voices in description and results. The data was collected, the analysis was done. It's not a good language. I conducted the data, I analyzed, we analyzed it, etc. This is a very simple tip. Avoid too many decimal points in your presentation and tables. Provide mean standard deviations. Make the table neat. Look at papers published in top journals and see how they present their tables and try to mimic that presentation style. Make tables look nice and tidy and add informative table notes. Table notes are very important. These kind of small issues matter for your success in getting the paper out. I mean, it's not necessary condition only, but it's, I would say, more of a sufficient condition. Even if it's a good paper, novel research idea, the presentation is bad, the formatting is bad, you have a big chance of getting the paper rejected. All right, so this is the data section. Then you have the empirical framework. This is where you discuss what is the equation that you're estimating, not the theoretical model. This is more of the empirical model. It has two components, the estimation strategy and the identification strategy. People use them interchangeably, but these are two different concepts. Estimation strategy is what is estimated and how is the inference done. Are you using OLS, or are you using a linear probability model, or are you using a dynamic panel data model? That is the empirical strategy. The identification strategy is what feature of the data allows for causal inference. What makes you confident that you're able to identify the relationship between T and Y? All right, that is the identification part. So the equations to be estimated put control variables in vector x, treatment variables, usually d or t, use proper subscriptions, I, j, k, l, etc. Usually I used I, you can see that, for example, household I. It's not very common to use household n, for example. So it's common to use household or enterprise observations, I. Time should be t. You use these proper letters. Latin letters are variables. Greek letters are coefficients. Right? So these are variables. D is variable, X is variable, beta, eta, alpha, these are all coefficients. So Y is here the outcome variable of household I in village J at time T. D is a treatment variable here. You can see that out. Y, I, J, T. The outcome variable of individual I. You can see it if it is firm I in industry J at time T. Let's say this is panel data, for example. This is how you would represent it. Estimation method, like I said, is maximum likelihood, GMM, OLS. How are these standard errors estimated? And hypothesis, for example, the null hypothesis or the hypothesis that you want to test is, this is significantly different from 0 or not. So this is where you discuss your empirical strategy. Then, the source of how D causes Y should be stated. Example, what is your source of identification? Here we say that our identification is randomized controlled trials. But by the way, identification is not only RCTs, right? There are 3 other well-known identification strategies. First one is, they call them RCTs, is called experimental method. Okay? Experimental. And the other one is quasi-experimental. Under quasi-experimental, we have 3 solid estimators. The first one is what we call DID. Difference in differences. Difference in differences happens when you have observational data of 2 rounds. Baseline data and then post-intervention data. Sometimes you have a baseline data, 1,000 individuals. The government comes and implements a certain safety net program, let's say, the South African pension system and things like that. They implement it, but you know that at baseline nobody received that. But at follow-up, you see that some of them received it. But still there is selection, right? But it's not as bad as a cross-sectional data because you will be able to deal with the selection using what we call matching methods. And that will give you difference in difference, propensity score matching estimation. This is one. The second is what we call the good old IV, instrumental variables estimation. An IV is a variable that is highly correlated. You remember, an IV has like 2 characteristics. It has to be relevant, and it has to be exogenous. And a good IV that has been used in applied research is rainfall in developing countries, in like agricultural setups. Rainfall is a proxy for, so an IV for income. You can use it because it affects your agricultural productivity. That means your income is affected. So rainfall might not directly affect your education, but it might affect it through your income. So IV. So there are different IVs, in the labor economics. You can use IVs. So it should be relevant. Exogenous. Relevant means it has to be correlated with the endogenous variable. Exogenous means it should not be correlated with the error term. We also call this situation orthogonality situation or condition. And the third method is the regression discontinuity design, which I explained a few minutes ago. You have to have either of these 3 4 of this, your paper should be using one of these methods to identify any causal relationship between X and Y. So, IV, DID, and RD methods can help you to identify. All right, so we've covered so many sections, 3 sections. I've paid attention. 3 sections. Conceptual framework, data section, and then empirical strategy and identification strategy.
Identification strategy. Yes. You mentioned right at the beginning, you spoke about this whole idea of some papers going the determinants of, right, which you self-test. Right, so. But if you are trying to identify factors, multiple factors that cause a specific thing, should each of those factors then actually be a different paper? Or does a paper just become too voluminous if you're trying to identify 4 or 5 factors that are influencing?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, you won't be able to identify the impact of all those factors at the same time. So you have to analyze in different setup. Some of them you cannot, it would be very hard. For example, what is the impact of being a woman actually on your wage? It is a correlation, right? Because it's not really a policy variable, so you can't change it. You want to understand the impact of being in a labor union, for example. That you might change, but it's going to take you a lot of resources actually to create the exogenous variation. So that's why researchers are completely avoiding that kind of, by the way, that kind of study is important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it at all. So don't misquote me here. Sometimes the association itself is important because that would be a starting point for more a causal study. But for a PhD thesis, usually, I don't know how the South African system works. In Europe, we have what we call a job market paper, JMP. And it's a very well-known abbreviation in the job market, by candidates. Oh, what's your JMP about? The job market paper is your most important paper, which describes your skills or your specialization in the PhD. That paper, if it is empirical, should have identification. There is no way of graduating actually without that in the good universities. So it's mostly for those kinds of papers. But even when you write your papers here, all the 3 papers are describing relationships, then what is your contribution? We'll come to, a big question, I think. So yes, you can do these kinds of studies, but it's limited. It doesn't provide policy input, for example. You cannot advise the government. These are the correlates, but it's hard to tell whether it's causal or not. So it's hard to advise the government what to do. To advise the government what to do, you have to pick up the most important variable, and all other factors being constant, you identify the effect of that. He raised before you.
Yeah, so I think part of my question you've answered it, because then you have other papers that are not using any of these.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. So it's hard to publish those in good journals, though. Yeah. And like I said, not all your papers can be like that. You have to invest. Go home tonight when this course is over. Try to identify the research topic that at least you'll be able to identify causal relationship. There's many of them, trust me.
Okay. So I think from what you're saying, I'm determined to I think I'll ask a question because I think I might have a problem because my other objectives is going to be looking at the determinants of inflation. So I'm thinking now, it becomes tricky because I was still thinking, I was considering I was going to be using structural equation modeling as we were trying to look at the relationship. So based on what you're saying, I think I might have a problem. But it means that I need to go back to the identification and try and look at, because you say it's policy, because I'm thinking, because would Mike be looking at more monitoring? So I'm thinking from what you're saying, then I have a bit of a problem.
So you're getting nervous. Yeah. I'm sorry, that was not the purpose of this course. So you were using time series data.
Yes, I am.
From South Africa only?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm more of a microeconometrician. I did time series at my master's studies like a long time ago, Angel Granger test and Johansson's test, everything. But I did not pursue it in the PhD because the micro is more attractive and there's so many reasons for that. So it's hard for me to give the advice, but there are some models that you can use to identify, VAR models. So you have to explore these methods where you can identify some causal relationships. Sometimes the dynamics itself is important, right? The dynamics, for example, you pick up a specific lagged effects and things like that. For example, a major monetary phenomena that happened 5 years ago, did it affect prices, for example, 5 years later? Something like that. So you have to do a little bit of reading of all the papers and see papers published in the Journal of Monetary Economics. That is your journal. Download all the papers, the most recent papers on inflation, and to try to see how they identify causal relationships. It should be possible. Was there someone else? No. Perfect. Results and discussion. This is the most important section, but unfortunately the least read section. Unless the reader is a reviewer or editor or a PhD student like you, who wants to understand how that analysis has been done. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to it. You have to do it to the maximum care possible. It follows the following order. Basic results, all right? Let's say that let's focus on one of these, enterprise RCTs. So what are the basic results? This is the treatment effect. I can give you another example. There's another paper that I'm sharing with you, just coming out in the European Journal of Agricultural Review. We measured the impact of the 2015-16 El Nino-induced drought. So there was a El Nino-induced drought, 2015-16. El Nino is a cooling off of the Pacific Ocean, so that results in major changes in weather throughout the world. So usually it is in Africa, it affected us by drought. So 60 million people were globally affected. There was drought in Malawi, Ethiopia, etc. And there was flooding, cyclones in Asia, Fiji, and all these places. So what did we do? Well, we had I'm using these examples in the meantime to demonstrate how you can identify causal relationships and how you can write the paper. So this is YIT. It's the outcome variable, which is livestock. All right? The livestock holdings of households, farm households. XITB plus CI plus UIT. This is a panel data specification. This is not a cross-sectional data specification. You can see that I have both I is equal to 1 up to N, T is equal to 1 up to T. So this is a typical panel data, yes.
I think the choice of the pen color will have impact on us.
Excuse me? Oh, the color. Oh, it's hard for you to see?
No, when it's black we can see, but now we can see.
Oh, I see. So we should use black. Let's see. YIT. All right.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. So I is equal to 1 up to N, and T is equal to 1 up to T. So we wanted to measure the impact of drought. So drought here is one of these X variables is drought. Or you can write it, if you want explicitly specifically, is equal to XITB plus eta DIT plus CI plus UIT. This is my specification. These are all the control variables that affect livestock, like your household size, your land size, your wealth, age of the head, gender of the head, all those socioeconomic characteristics, they go in here. They're correlates. So this is drought. Drought is exogenous because it's exogenous variable that households do not, unless households move from one drought area to another drought area, from one wave to another. But that's unlikely in many places. People would not change just because there was drought. They cannot move away, and you can verify that using the data. So we had at least 2 rounds of data. So what happened is we had data in 12, 13. Then the drought happened in 2015, drought. And then in 2015, 16, we have another round, round 3. This is round 2. Okay? Round 2 and round 3. So this is treated as a baseline data. Nobody was affected by drought. Then the drought happened, it affected some. Some of them were affected. I think 52% were affected. Can you imagine? 52%. So we have a very large data that is representative nationally. That's about 3,500 households. So we measure the impact of the drought on livestock holding. So a difference in differences is what? You compare the differences between the treatment and the control group between the two periods. So the basic result is, we just present this coefficient. We see that drought affected livestock and dairy production by this much. This coefficient is your outcome, variable of interest. The outcome variables are Y and IT. That's milk production and livestock. So we started with the basic results. Then you go with the robustness checks. Like, are your results robust? For example, when you change the definition of drought, how do you define drought? There are so many different definitions. Sometimes they say that, well, if the rainfall is below 15 percentile, that's severe drought. Some say if it's 20. So you change these from 15 to 20. You use different data, etc. So you verify that. Change in functional form. So when you use logs, the results, do they stand or do they change? Then treatment heterogeneity. This is another important analysis. That means how does drought does not affect everyone equally. It affects, for example, women-headed households more harshly than male-headed households, because these women-headed households have poor network, discrimination in labor market, credit market, etc. So there's so many different reasons. You interact with gender. Sometimes the rich and the poor are not affected equally. So you interact by wealth. That's what we call heterogeneous analysis, treatment heterogeneous analysis. Then there's what we call mechanisms. What are the mechanisms that explain your results? All right? So a mechanism is a pathway through which your intervention affects the outcome variable of interest. Sometimes different mechanisms might result in different policy implications and results. I can give you an excellent example. We conducted an RCT in India. That RCT was to see the impact of social networks. What we did was we selected 3 people from each village, and one person is a control variable, a control group. The other person would be incentivized. That means we gave them a solar lantern, and we gave them money, paid them that, okay, we give you this solar lantern, you charge it with solar energy, and you can light your entire house. It's better than a kerosene lamp. Then we told them, you go and tell your friends about this. Invite them for a tea. They don't drink coffee there, they drink tea. In a tea meeting, you tell them your experience. How is this solar lantern? How does it work? How does it, help you, and etc. This is what we call a marketing campaign. And the other group, we just left them as they are, because if they're friends, they will obviously talk about it, and then you will see any impact. So those people who received that information, they were invited at the tea meeting, were able to pay more, or they're willing to pay more for the solar lantern. So clearly, providing that information through their friends was very helpful. But there's a big question here. Let me ask you one question. If I buy an iPhone that you have never seen before, everybody knows about that iPhone, but let's say that there's a new technology. I come in the classroom and then I show everyone, guys, I bought it from Johannesburg, around the Sandton shopping mall. Next time, there's a big chance that some of you will go and get that new technology. But there are always 2 reasons that explain that. One possibility might be, you see the technology, wow, this looks cool. I might be able to use this technology for this purpose, for that purpose. This is what we call learning. You learned about the technology. But to say there's another possibility, people like imitating, especially within family contexts. My sister and her husband, they're getting this new couch. Hey, honey, we should change this couch too. That is not learning. What is that? That's competition. So the two are completely different mechanisms, but the outcome variables are the same. So when you are offering the government, for example, that, oh, okay, your neighbors actually bought this new improved seed, when they see the neighbor using, did they do that because they learned the benefits, or did they do that to catch up with their neighbor? The two have different policy implications. That's what we call mechanisms. What is the mechanism that explains? The outcome variable. And then limitations, caveats. What are the limitations of this study? You have to be honest about it. You shouldn't hide them, because people would always be able to find it out. When you are honest, people will respect you. But when you want to hide it and go through, people would be pissed. So it's very important to be upfront. Tables properly labeled, titled, and provide important information. Example: number of observations, R-square significance, standard errors, etc., etc. Finally, the final section of the paper is the conclusion section. The conclusion is a summary of what has been done, one paragraph usually. What was the objective of the paper, what data used, recap the key limitations, the key findings as well. Policy implication: if the paper not done to make technical points should originate from your analysis. One big problem that we see in conclusions is that people become passionate about recommending all sorts of policies that we know from textbooks. Your conclusion should originate from your analysis. Otherwise, it would be crossing the ethical line. If you are focused on the impact of credit on productivity, it has to be related to credit. Right? It shouldn't be about anything else. And then if you have implications for future research, etc., then you will explain that. Usually the conclusion is 2, 3, 4 maximum paragraphs. Then we come to introduction, which we're going to do after coffee. Any questions? We're done.